Hi there. Today I'd like to talk about VPN. Now here at F5 Networks, we've been getting quite a few questions regarding VPN solutions, and rightfully so. With the pandemic and the COVID-19 crisis impacting the world globally, organizations are scrambling to find ways to either expand or implement a remote access solution. So let's head on over to the demo area and discuss this a little further. So some of the questions regarding VPN that we're getting have to do with existing customers. And the top question we're getting is, how many CCUs do I have, and do I have enough to support my current remote workers? Well, CCUs stand for concurrent user license, and it's how big IP and the F5 determine how many users are allowed to access your appliance or VE via the VPN. Now, every appliance or VE license comes with a base number of CCUs if you have APM or Access Policy Manager licensed. In addition, depending on your license will determine how many CCUs you have. So there's a couple factors there that you have to weigh. Now, if you're asking about CCUs, chances are you already have APM provisioned and you're wondering, how can I find that? And we're going to go through this in just a minute via the command line, and we're going to show you also in the GUI where you can find out where those CCUs are located. The other question we'll be getting is around two-factor. And obviously, the advantages of two-factor. You should be implementing a two-factor solution. There's no reason why you shouldn't. And the big IP and Access Policy Manager make it very, very easy to implement a third-party two-factor. And we're going to cover Duo Security. And the reason why we're going to cover that is because F5 uses Duo Security internally as a two-factor mechanism. The other questions we're getting is around best practices and optimization and avoiding CPU spike. So this really is around current customers, and the recent spike in VPN users has put load on their appliances or VEs. So there's probably a reason for that. It probably already had load on those devices or VEs. Maybe they were running a very high CPU intensive module like ASM or Application Security Manager, which is our WAF or Web Application Firewall. And because they've ramped up VPN users, it has certainly put load on the box. And that's because VPN uses TLS, SSL, and as we all know, that particular process is a very expensive process. So we're going to show you how to optimize your current configuration to help with maybe some of that load. And then we're going to run through a simple, very, very simple configuration of VPN using a full tunnel. We're going to show you just how easy and fast it is to get one spun up in your environment. And then finally, we're going to show you where the client and the software is on the big IP so you can get that off and onto your client so they can connect to your new VPN solution. So let's get started. Okay, so we've got quite a few articles here, or web links, and there's maybe 5. There's not a ton. Don't worry about memorizing these. I'm going to put these in the comments of the YouTube video here so you can reference them later. But we're going to cover these real quick, and these align with what we just saw on that slide. So the first one is K Article 15032, determining license limits on the APM. And this is where you're going to go to get instructions on how to find out how many CCUs you have. And something I want to point out real quick is that we have this applies to button here. Let me zoom in a little bit. It's very important that you check this out when you're on our K articles. And let me back up just a bit. Our K articles are our knowledge base articles. And you're going to find this at askf5.com or support.f5.com. So you'll see this link, Ask F5, right? This is where F5 archives all of their solution articles. We used to call these SOLs, or SOL was the prefix. We've recently changed it to K for knowledge base. But anyways, make sure that you are on the right solution article for your version of TMOS. Now, in this particular example, this shows that it applies to everything from 11x to 15x. Now, if you're on something earlier than 11x, you probably have other problems, but that's neither here nor there. In other cases, you may run across another article, which we'll show in just a minute, that it only applies to version 14x through 15. So make sure that you're on the right article for your version of software. Software changes all the time. F5 may change a knob or do something different. You want to make sure that you're on the right solution article for your platform. So enough of that. Let's continue scrolling down and take a look at this article, right? And I want to highlight or show here the show APM license command right here, tmsh show APM license. And this is what's going to show you via the command line how many access sessions you are licensed for. And as far as CCUs go, total connectivity sessions are right here, which says 500. Now let's pull up a big IP, which we're going to be configuring here in just a moment. And let's see how that lines up. So my particular big IP has the same number of licensed sessions. So I have 2,500 on this big IP, and I have 500 total connectivity sessions right here. And that shows you via the command line if you wanted to. And you can also see what current activity sessions we have. We have 0 at this moment in time. Now in the GUI, like I said, I mentioned that we could see this in the GUI. If you come down to System and License, you can also see in your license up here the 500 CCU and the 2,500 access sessions that are licensed. Now it's not going to show you what's currently being used. You'll have to get that via the command line or do some logging in your APM policy to get real-time activity on your licenses. So let's move on and go to our two-factor, because that was another question being asked by our customers. Now, I mentioned Duo Security, and I want to mention Duo Security because, number one, we use them internally for our two-factor mechanism. Secondly, I've actually stood this up before and configured it, and it is super easy. The configuration guides are well documented. It took me like half a day to stand this up. It requires minimal resources in your network. You can throw it on a Windows server box. It does need access out to Duo's cloud servers, but that's the only really outside requirement. Other than that, super easy to deploy. It's reliable. It's very fast, and it's a pretty awesome solution. So I recommend that you take a look at it. In addition, I believe they still give you 10 free users. So as an organization, as a proof of concept, you can go ahead and stand this up and test drive it and see how you like it. All right, moving on. We talked about optimization and CPU spike. So recently, our APM SME group distributed this article. And in fact, you can see the original publication date was March 18th, 2020. So not too long ago. Because we were getting questions about, hey, my big IP appliance is like freaking out. It's like hitting 100% CPU. What can I do about it? Well, there's a couple things you could do. You could scale out big IPs, right? Or you could turn some knobs and switches to get things optimized. And that's what this article does. So if you come down, it gives you recommended actions to get your CPU level down. So maybe you have compression enabled. Well, let's disable that for time being. Maybe you don't have the TLS ciphers properly positioned and they're not hardware accelerated. All right, make sure those are hardware accelerated. Let's reduce or eliminate the ACLs on the policy, right? So maybe have your next-gen firewall or firewall downstream handle those ACLs. And then there's connection mirroring and split tunneling, traffic shaping, and path controller. Split tunneling is probably a big one. That's going to do, in addition to easing the load, it's going to ease the load of the traffic traversing your network as well. So these are all ones that you probably want to take a look at. Scaling out, as I mentioned earlier, is another option, but if that's not an option, just check these recommendations to make sure that your policy is properly optimized. Another article here I wanted to share was the Big IP Access Policy Manager and Network Access documentation. Now, F5 has tons of documentation, and not just for Access Policy Manager. We've got documentation for our Application Security Module Manager. We've got LTM knowledge. We've got DNS knowledge. We got all sorts of knowledge for everything you can imagine with a Big IP. I want to point this one out because you'll be using this pretty often to configure your VPN. Aside from what I'm going to show you in just a moment, the one I'm going to demo for you is going to be a very, very simple policy. But if there's other things that you want to do, such as configuring ACLs or setting DNS or static hosts, maybe you want to do some drive mapping, maybe you want to configure some different Webtop options, you could find all that information right here. And it's very well documented, and it's going to help you on your journey to getting your VPN solution fully configured. Okay, well, let's get to it. Let's configure a big IP, and I'm going to grab my phone here, and I'm going to set a timer because I said at the beginning of this video that it was going to be super easy, super quick to get a VPN solution stood up. So I wanted to prove that and time this. So I'm going to start a timer right now. Now, my particular network configuration is super simple. It's sitting in AWS right now. I've got one single big IP protecting a single Linux server right behind it. Now, you may say, oh, dude, that's super simple. Well, conceptually, it's the same, right? We've got security groups, NACLs in AWS. You would have a firewall, multiple firewalls in your on-prem, and then you've got a server farm, right? It's the same thing. I just don't have a server farm. I've got a Linux server. So the concepts are the same. For the sake and purpose of this demo, we wanted to keep it super simple. So I just wanted to explain the topology for you real quick. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a AAA object. And the reason why we're doing this is because we're going to use a wizard on the big IP to create our VPN configuration. And we're going to use the wizard because I said it's going to be simple and fast. And I'm going to show you how to do that. But before we do that, we can't, because of the limitations of the wizard, it doesn't allow me to select a local database authentication method. So I have to create the local database authentication first. And I will say that not many people know that the big IP is capable of housing a local database for authentication. And it's not heavily used, right? It's used in these particular scenarios, but it could also be used in if you have a disconnected use case, like an emergency, maybe something like this, right? Where you need to give access, but you don't have time to configure an Active Directory connection or spin up a new Active Directory or LDAP. This will allow you to give temporary access and use this database authentication method. So it's very handy. So we're going to leave everything here at the defaults. You can read about this in the guides, setting the lockout intervals and the thresholds. We're not going to mess with any of that. We're just going to create the database now, and then we're going to create a user for the database because we need a user to authenticate with. So let's create the user. We're going to call this user F5 admin, and let's give it a password. And we're not going to do forced password change here. You could do that if you want. It's already pre-populated with the database instance we created. You could come in here and put some personal information. You could even create user groups if you wanted to. So you could create like a Linux user group or a Windows Server admin group, whatever you like. We're not going to do that. We're going to keep everything pretty simple here. And we're done. So we've got our database created and we have our user created. Super simple stuff, right? So let's go to our wizard. Let me just come in a little bit here, zoom in so you can see this. So when you hit wizard, it automatically populates with the network access setup wizard. And it gives you a description of what that is. And it's got some other wizards here too, like if you want to set up a web app, what we call a, LTM APM, which is basically just protecting an application with authentication, you could do that. You could also do a portal access setup wizard where it uses the same type of Webtop, but it doesn't use VPN as a VPN traditionally. It's what the buzzword is in the industry is a clientless VPN. This is where you would do something like that in the portal access setup wizard. But let's get started with our network access setup because I told you this is going to be quick and I'm burning time here. So policy name, we're going to name it VPN. We're going to enable the full Webtop. I'm not going to get into what that is. I'm going to show you what that is at the end of the demo. We'll see what that is. We're going to disable client-side checks, and then we're going to give it a gateway address, right? So the 2.1 in this instance is the external subnet on the big IP that this is the gateway on the AWS side. So 2.1 is the gateway that the external subnet on the self IP of the big IP will use to direct outgoing traffic. So let's create an NTP server. Now we're going to give it just a generic one. No need to configure any more, but as a best practice, you should be configuring at least, I believe now F5 recommends a minimum of 3, could be 4, but the more the better, right? NTP is an important piece of your network infrastructure, and it is an important piece of your big IP configuration. A lot of issues occur on the big IP because companies don't have NTP properly configured. Now, we created that local database instance first, and that's because when we're using the wizard, it doesn't give us the option to select that local database option. This is for the wizard in the network access. I don't know why. I think it used to be there, but it's not there anymore. Regardless, we had to create it first. And what we're going to do here is we're going to select no authentication. And we're going to go back into the policy manually and add it. So let's click next. This is where you're going to add a lease pool. Now, we're keeping it super simple. So I'm just assigning an IP address on the internal side, self IP. It's going to SNAT anyways in this instance. We're using AutoMap. So it's going to use the self IP of the big IP on the internal side. So this really doesn't matter. But production, you can choose a SNAT or not. You can use lease pools, multiple lease pools, assign them to users based on Active Directory attributes, whatever you like. But we're going to keep it super simple here. Let's add. Let's click next. Once again, we're going to keep things simple. No compression. We're going to use a full tunnel for our traffic. We're going to force everything through the tunnel. You could use split tunneling here, right? So we can add in our address LAN space that we want to allow access to. We can do things like allow local subnet. We can do client-side security, which if you check this, will prohibit routing table changes on the client machine if they're connected to the VPN, so an added security measure. And then DTLS. So we're not going to get into that either, but I highly recommend you check it out because if you may have a use case in your organization where you need to really optimize traffic, and DTLS is one way to do that. So let's just force all traffic through tunnel and click next. We're going to keep the name server the same. Obviously, this is where you would configure all of that. You can set static host here as well. We're going to keep everything the way it is. And finally, this is where we're going to set our VIP, our virtual IP address. And this particular is a private IP. And this is NATed to a public IP that I have configured in AWS. And then we're also doing a redirect on the server from HTTP to HTTPS. So it'll allow a user to access this initially over clear text, but it will be, he or she will be redirected to the HTTPS server. And let's create next. We now come to our review configuration screen. It's going to give you an overview of what you've done. This all looks good. So we're going to click next. I'm just going to scroll out or zoom out just a bit here so we can get a wider screen here. So this is the setup summary. Now I mentioned that we're using a wizard. Now there's an article created by an SC or a former SC called Steve Lyons. He's now an account manager with F5. And he goes through this setup, a VPN setup, manually, meaning that you have to create the access profile, the connectivity profile, the Webtop, all of this stuff, right? And it requires, if you don't have a guide like he created, it requires some deep APM knowledge. If you don't have that knowledge or don't have his guide, using the wizard is an easy way to get this set up very quickly, like I just showed you. Basically, we're done. We've configured the VPN. Now we've got an extra step we've got to do. We've got to add in that AAA object. But for the most part, most of the configuration is done. So if we look here, we can see that it created the lease pool, created a Webtop, profiles, and even created our virtual servers. So pretty cool stuff. So we're done. Well, we're almost done. We need to go into the policy, but I just wanted to show you that it in fact created the virtual servers for us. So automatically done for you. So let's go to access. Let's access our policy. We named it VPN, so this is the correct one. Let's click edit. Okay, so this is our policy. This is the VPE, or the Visual Policy Editor. This is where you configure your access policy. And it's very intuitive in the way that it flows from left to right. So you can imagine starting with our login page on the very left and moving through the policy to our resources, and then it's either an allow or deny. Now in this case, we don't have any authentication. So we could log in this login page right now and freely access the network because we're not authenticating, there's no deny. It's not a really good setup. So let's add some authentication so the bad guys can't get in. So authentication. So you can see here, we've got quite a few components that we could do here. We could do SAML, TACACS, LDAP, Active Directory. There's a lot of things you could do here, and this, you would be using these normally in a production environment. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to use a local database that we created earlier as our authentication mechanism. So we're going to add that item. We're going to come over to the agent and select our database instance that we created earlier. We're going to leave everything defaults. We're going to click save. And now we're good. What we're going to do here last is apply the access policy, because anytime you make changes in a VPE, you have to apply the policy changes. And it's going to let you know that with that yellow. So we've applied it and we're good to go. So now we have a full policy. It's very simple, but we have a login page right here. If you click on that, you can actually modify this to whatever you like. So we could add additional fields here if we want to, like a PIN. If we had a hardware token, you can configure that here, right? You do a lot of different things. The VPE is extremely flexible. So after we log in, we passed in our username and password is going to get passed to this authenticate our database that we created. And if we're successful, we're then going to be issued the resources. That's our Webtop and our VPN. And we're going to show you that in just a moment. And then we get an allow. We get access to it. If we're locked out, we get a deny. If our password and username are wrong, we're going to fall back to this branch, which is deny. And we keep going until we either locked out or we successfully log in. All right, so that's it. We have configured the VPN, and it took a little under 12 minutes. I've done it faster. Obviously, we had to create the database and do some explaining, but I could probably configure this in probably 3 minutes, maybe less. All right, so let's close this out, and let's log into the VPN, right? So remember, we have a full tunnel here. So I'm going to lose connectivity to the outside world and only have access to that interior Linux server that we had talked about earlier, because this is a full tunnel. So right away, I'm presented with the login page, which means I have connectivity to our newly configured VIP, which is a good start, right? Let's see if we can get logged in and authenticate. So let's log in, log on, whatever. Things are looking good. And yes, we are logged in to the Webtop. And we're not connected to the network access yet. I mentioned earlier about a Webtop and what it really is. This is our Webtop. Now this is very simple Webtop, and this is fully customizable, by the way. And we have a single object here, VPN. We could add other VPN objects here if we wanted to. We could add things like Windows servers for RDP. We could add Linux servers for SSH connections. We could add SAML third-party applications in here, like Workday or ServiceNow or Salesforce, whatever you need, as long as it can handle even legacy auth or next-gen auth, we can configure this on here. This is also known as the buzzword of clientless VPN. This also fits very tightly with our zero trust solution, which uses per request instead of per session policy. That's another time for a different video, but I just wanted to mention that. So now that we have access here, let's take a look at our big IP and take a look at our active sessions, right? because now we're logged in, we can take a look at a little bit of the session variables that are here. So this had a little green dot, which basically means that I am connected. That's an active session. And here's my logging here. So we can see that I logged in as F5 admin. The VPN resource was assigned, connectivity resource, a Webtop was assigned, and then we see the allow and the access policy is full. Awesome. So in addition to this, if we go into, you can go into further with like session variables to really use those to build out and tweak out your policy and really customize it. So let's go back to our VPN, right? And let's actually connect to the VPN. Now I'm using the browser functionality here, and we're gonna continue because it's giving me a warning about the certificate, and that's fine. But I'm using, instead of using the client, I'm using the browser plugin for this particular demo. And we can see that's connecting, and I'm now connected. So I'm a full tunnel connection. I've lost connectivity everywhere else because I don't have a route configured on the inside to allow me out in AWS. Remember, this is a simple configuration, but it does demonstrate the full access tunnel to where I've lost connection and I only have access to that one resource in the inside of my network. Here you can, show your routing table. You can show your IP configuration, right? And this allows you to really kind of dig into the network access part of the client side. There's also some really cool diagnostics that you can do. Again, a video for another time. So let's pull up a command line. And that's not the command line I wanted. Pull this one over. So I have this queued up. So this is my Linux server that we're protecting, right? We're allowing VPN access to. And you can see this is a private IP, and I should not be able to access this from the outside. The only reason why I can access it is because I have a VPN tunnel to the inside of my environment in AWS. And I don't have username and password set up yet on this box. I just spun it up, so I'm using an SSH key to authenticate into this box. So I already have it queued up. Let's go ahead and hit enter, and we can see that I was immediately given access. All right, let's come in here a little bit, take a little bit closer look. 10.03.29, it's an Ubuntu server on the inside. So, I've effectively proven that we've stood up a SSL VPN solution on a big IP in less than 12 minutes. I probably could have done it a lot quicker if I didn't have to explain everything. You could do the same. I've given access to an internal protected resource that's being protected by the F5 big IP. So super easy, super simple, and highly secure. Now, before we end the video, I told you that I would show you the big IP, so the client side and all the browser plugin and so on and so forth. So before I do that, I need to disconnect because I believe I lost connection to my big IP session. So let's go ahead and close this out, and come back over here. And I did lose connection, right? But because I terminated that tunnel, I have connection back. Let's close this out a little bit, and then let's go. Where are you going to find that plugin and the browser plugin stuff is on the downloads. And if you clicked, I went kind of fast here. If you click the about and then click downloads, you'll get your big IP edge client over here. Let me scroll in or zoom in a little bit so you can see that, because that's kind of hard to see. So here you can see the big IP edge client for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. We have the component. We've got the troubleshooting utility that I mentioned briefly just a minute ago, where you can put onto a Windows machine to troubleshoot client connectivity issues. If you've ever dealt with that or dealt with support, this is what they would tell you what to do and install. There's also a command line VPN client. Not many people know that exists, but it does, and I've seen some actually cool things done by some of our SEs and solution architects here, where they've actually put this client on a Raspberry Pi and use that as a VPN connection from their network to the cloud. So some cool stuff, Science Lab stuff that they've done fun stuff. But yeah, this is where you find also your browser components. Now, the browser component should automatically install and prompt the user. Make sure that that user has the correct permissions on that machine to install this, or at least pre-install it for them. And that all that information is available here and on Ask F5 as well. So I just want to show you that because not everyone knows where that exists, and if you don't know where it exists, it can be kind of cumbersome to find. So, well, that's it. That is the big IP and the VPN solution. We've covered the optimization, two-factor, any troubleshooting, how to identify where your CCU is, how many CCUs you have, how to configure the VPN. I said it was going to be easy. It is easy. Took us under 12 minutes to get that configured, and you're ready to go and fully secure for your remote workers. So until next time, in the next tech session, take it easy.